Welcome, everyone. My name is Latrice Williams, and I'm the Director of Membership and Communications for Grantmakers in Aging. We are a national membership organization that serves as a network and resource for funders and a champion for aging-related issues and investments. With over 120 members, GIA works to mobilize the social, intellectual, and financial capital required to improve the experience of aging now and in the future. Thank you to the John A. Hartford Foundation for supporting today's webinar. We also want to thank our partners, HelpAge USA, American Society on Aging, and the National Council on Aging for presenting today's webinar with us. We're so pleased to be joined in discussion with representatives from HelpAge who work with partners in 86 countries to respond to humanitarian crises. The idea for today's webinar came about in conversations with one of our board members who reflected on the fact that the crisis in the Ukraine has received tremendous attention. But what about crises happening in other parts of the world that rarely make the news? Over the next hour, we are joined by a distinguished group of panelists to talk about crises happening under the radar and myths that surround the care and resources available for older adults during natural disasters, war, and other crises. We will be making today's presentation available to anyone who wishes to view it later, including the slides and the audio. We also want to remind you to submit any questions for our panelists in the Q&A box. I would like to now turn things over to Jane Buchanan, Advocacy Advisor at HelpAge USA, to begin our conversation. Jane.
Thank you so much, Latrice. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I thank in advance our panelists and all of the attendees. So Latrice, as you mentioned, emergencies like Ukraine have stayed in the headlines, but others really get the attention that they deserve or only briefly. So we're really glad to have this opportunity to combat myths about older people, shed light on some of their realities, and hear from our colleagues who are working in different regions of the world about what can be done to better support older people in humanitarian emergencies. So to kick us off, I'll share a few slides just as kind of a bit of background, and then we'll have a panel discussion. So the next slide, please. So HelpAge USA works in the United States and with our HelpAge Global Network partners around the world to advance the well-being and inclusion of older people. And HelpAge International is a UK-based secretariat for the global network with 160 members working in now 90 countries. The next slide. So as I think many of us are aware, the number of humanitarian crises is growing, including due to armed conflicts and climate-induced natural disasters. According to the UN, 274 million people required humanitarian assistance and protection this year. And that is a substantial increase of over 40 million people from just a year ago, which was already the highest figure in decades. And what often happens is that the worst affected people are the most invisible, particularly older people. The next slide. And why is this important? It's important because all of us here, we care about the equal rights and dignity for older people. And also because, according to the World Health Organization, there are now more than 1 billion people aged 60 years and older, with most living in low and middle income countries. As of 2020, people over 60 outnumbered children under age 5 globally. So unless we improve how we support older people in humanitarian crises, the consequences will only grow in magnitude, while the upside could be significantly more wide-reaching. Next slide, please. So specifically regarding older people, an estimated 26 million of them are affected by humanitarian crises. And this is based on data in 2019, but that number is most likely increased, even if we just consider the impacts on older people of the war on Ukraine. Next, and at the same time, there's very little humanitarian aid, almost none, that goes directly to older people. So there are a number of common but false stereotypes that can help explain why older people are often not given the adequate attention in humanitarian crises. So for example, we frequently hear that older people are going to be cared for by their families or by their governments. Or there's an assumption that they are passive and lacking in agency. And so they aren't sought out for their knowledge and the inputs that they can have into problem solving. Next slide. In reality, there are a lot of barriers that older people face in trying to access safe and dignified support. So support networks, including family and community and others, are often dramatically disrupted during crises. There's a lack of accessible humanitarian aid and services, which can mean that older people with disabilities, physical or cognitive disabilities, aren't receiving the assistance that is available. Older people can often have specific health and nutritional needs that aren't met in a generalized humanitarian response. And older people can also be subject to particular types of abuse and neglect, and particularly older women. Next slide. So one of the things that can help reduce these barriers and ensure stronger rights protection of older people is data and analysis. So HelpAge regularly conducts rapid needs assessments in emergencies to guide our response and hopefully the response of partners and other organizations. So this is an example of a rapid needs response analysis from Haiti, where the AARP Foundation provided disaster relief and recovery support after the 2021 earthquake. So here, interestingly, we see how some of those myths don't hold up. So 2/3 of respondents felt that they weren't included in the humanitarian response to the earthquake. So this really speaks to this idea or this assumption that older people are necessarily included in a generalized humanitarian response and that there isn't a need to take into consideration their specific requirements. We also see here that many people reported not having sufficient access to food and clean water. So again, older people aren't going to be sufficiently cared for all the time by others. And the next slide. And this just shows a bit about those specific ways in which HelpAge works to support and empower older people. So there are many different ways. You know, some of these things include cash transfers directly to older people that allows them to choose in a dignified way the things that are most important to them that meet their requirements. We have psychological support even in difficult contexts, you know, using phone and other outreach to physically to people in their homes to deliver aid and services and the like. So now I'd like to have our panelists introduce themselves and we'll get started in our discussion. Carole, Amber, Moise, and Francisco, if you're there. So Carole, why don't we start with you? Can you just introduce yourself for our group? Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Hi, everybody. My name is Carole Ageng'o. I'm from Kenya and I'm currently speaking from Nairobi, Kenya. I am the Global Initiatives Lead and the Regional Representative for Africa at HelpAge International. It's a pleasure to be here. HelpAge works on the rights of older people across the world, and you'll hear more about our work shortly.
Thank you so much. Francisco?
Thank you. Good afternoon here already. I am Francisco Osuna, work as Humanitarian Program Manager for the Latin American Caribbean region and part of the HelpAge International Humanitarian Global Team. It's a very good opportunity to be here with you.
Thanks, Francisco. And you're based in Bogota, is that right?
Yes,
Yes.
I am in Bogota.
Thanks for joining. Moise, please introduce yourself. We're so happy to see you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me clearly? I'm Syed Moise and I'm working with HelpAge as a country director in Pakistan.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amber.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amber Talburt, and I serve as the Senior Director of Grants at AARP Foundation, based in Washington, D.C. And I also have the pleasure of serving as a Grant Makers and Aging Board member.
Wonderful. So we're thrilled to have you with us today, everyone. So I have a few questions that I'll ask each of you so that we can all learn about from your rich experience supporting older people in different contexts. And while you do work in different regions, there's important themes that do cut across so much of the work that we do to support older people that can really enrich our understanding. So Carole, I'd really like to start with your work in Africa. So again, we've heard and we've been talking about there are a lot of myths about older people, their place in society, what happens to them in difficult situations. So from your perspective and your work, what do you think some of the myths and truths that are important for us to hear about? Thanks.
Okay, maybe let me start. I don't know whether I should start with the good or the bad, but let me start with the myths. One of the myths is that older people are revered, respected, and cared for. And this is an evolving myth because previously, older people were indeed cared for, they were revered. When I grew up, I knew that older people were to be cared for, but this is not the truth anymore because there's a push for resources. Resources are getting very limited, and older people are seen to be standing in the way of resources. And so individuals, communities, and governments are neglecting older people. And I think this is very resource-based. That's a moot question, but I think it's very resource-based. The other myth is that in humanitarian crises, gender-based violence, and I'm singling out gender-based violence because in humanitarian crises, there are all levels of violence and other forms of abuse that goes on. But gender-based violence and sexual and gender-based violence is seen to happen to younger women especially, but this is not true. Older people face a lot of gender-based violence, and there's a lot of sexual violence that is meted out on older women in humanitarian crises. Then the other myth that I'd like to highlight is that older people are seen to be vulnerable and not able to bring anything forth in the maybe in the discussions around addressing or mitigating humanitarian crisis. And so they're neglected in the face of any humanitarian crisis, whether it's in the early warning stages, whether it's in the actual crisis or the post-crisis stage. And we see that, I'll turn to the truth now. The truth is that older people have agency, they have a voice, and they contribute a lot in the mitigation and management of humanitarian crises. One of the things that happens is that older people take care of their families. The reverse is not true. We know, for example, I'll give a very quick example. In northern Kenya right now, we have a drought situation that is happening. And the people who are taking care of young children as the young adults and not the parents of these children go out to fetch for food or to go out to look for pasture are the older men and women, and particularly the older women. And they care for these children without anything much to offer. When the agencies and organizations come to respond to humanitarian crisis, they do not see older people as a unique group of people whose needs are different from the general population. So I think I'll stop there, Jane, for the moment.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Carole. So yeah, these are really important points. And I think it's something that we discuss in other contexts as well, just the different roles and identities that older people have. And that's so crucial in understanding how we respond in humanitarian crises. So Moise, I'd like to turn to you next, if you're still there. Actually, maybe I'll go to Francisco. So Francisco, yeah, we're really interested to hear about, it's kind of a different type of challenge or an issue that happens, in a lot of countries, but certainly applies to Latin America where you work. So in places like Haiti, where there's humanitarian crises that are ongoing and they're made more complex by, failing state structures, problems of corruption and violence, there are particular risks and challenges to supporting older people. So I'd like to hear from you, how is it possible to make a difference in supporting older people in a situation as difficult as that?
Okay, thank you, Jane. Can you hear me well? Good. So first, I just realized there are a good number of our of the agencies and donors that support us in Latin America here. So first of all, I want to say thank you, but I also see a good number of our local and international NGO partners present. So I'd like to say also hello and thank you, because that's what HelpAge is. We are a network, not an NGO. Secondly, well, to address your question, my learning would be that the power of change is inside communities. That's my main learning. The way that rights get assured is in a bottoms-up approach, not the opposite. If you want to work to include older people, you need to work bottoms up. And then lives start to change. And the other principle would be one we very much regard in the humanitarian sector: localization. You work local, you work in the field, you support those who know how to do it there and are part of the communities. So the parting point would be that if we only hear that in addition to political crisis and gang control of vast zones of Haiti, including the main roads and key areas in Port-au-Prince, then I think we keep stalled by the problem. If we only pay attention to problems that are deep, critical, like, inflation, fuel scarcity, lack of food, robbery, bribes, internal displacement, and color spread, and we say that this is the whole picture of Haiti, well, there's nothing to do. But the question to me is not what's happening, but what can we change and how? Especially when we talk about older people inclusion. What can we change and how? And in that, I would say that what is working for us is to move from the big picture to the community level. If we listen well, the local picture might be different. We have learned that in the places we are in South Haiti, well, 45% of the population are older people. They have more than 60 years old, even couples. In the places where we're in South of, we have learned that if you support your local partner technically and financially, if you help and build capacities for quality management, you will find out that they are able to help because they can build agreements inside the community with all actors, including gangs. That's something that's very difficult for NGOs. So by August, when we ended a quite meaningful emergency assistance funded by precisely AARP, many thanks for being here and in Haiti too. we intended to start with very basic humanitarian aid, and then we moved to slightly build the stabilization conditions. But you know, timing is sometimes key and miraculous. 2 days ago, for this webinar, 2 days ago, our local partner, the FNGA, the Foundation of Grandance, just sent some pictures of the effects of the sustainability of this process. So a large percentage of our close to 1,000 families with older people were successful in harvesting yam and growing baby goats. Baby goats are not, I would say, not precisely for milk. They are for compost. And they are for older people. They are the pet. They build relationships. So as a result, nowadays, each family is able to harvest about 800 kilograms of yam. Less than half of that will cover their needs for their nutritional needs for up to 8 months, the next harvesting time. With the rest, they are selling in the local markets because, you know, there's food scarcity. So they might be able to raise up to $200, $250 of revenue. Well, that's, if we calculate that we can provide that food kit assistance for 1 month with $42 to $50, we are building inside small communities, we are building food security, even when we are in a context of hunger, you know, which is dramatic in South Haiti. So if we stand only in the sort of chaotic situation of Haiti, we will not learn that we still can do if we adopt a localization and inclusion perspective, especially older people lead. I will tell more about this later. I think that's it for now. Jane, we will tell some more things later. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much, Francisco. I think this is so important, and how working directly with communities can be so meaningful and have such an impact, and not only kind of in the immediate humanitarian response, but also for the long term. So really making an investment. I think that's really important. Thank you. So Moise, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the experience of your work in Pakistan. And, you know, in particular, you know, I mean, something again that comes up in many of the countries that HelpAge and others work in, you know, is that there's just not enough information kind of about the specific needs of older people. You know, and it's something that impacts tremendously on how humanitarian organizations, governments, and others are working. So I'd like to just hear a little bit about like your experience in Pakistan, you know, on this issue of kind of the challenges in getting good information. And then, you know, once there is some understanding of the needs of older people, you know, how is that used into implementation? Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for arranging such a webinar on an important subject. Recently, you will be aware that Pakistan was hit by a flood, and it's like a climate-induced flood. It's with heavy rains and floods, and 33 million people are affected by the flood, and around 1 million people, 1 million of the houses were damaged in the flood. So the flood is huge. And also, if you see the number of affected people, and then within that number, the older people, the older men and women, they are also affected. But when we look for the data, for the actual data, which age group is like more affected, and during the need assessment, that what are the specific needs of the different age groups, then its information is not available. And we are struggling to find out this information from different sources. But the need assessment or the rapid need assessment, it does provide the information that this much men and women and children are affected, but it's not provided the number of the older people or the person with disability, because these are the two most affected you can say segment of the society during these kind of natural disaster. They are already vulnerable, and these disasters increase their vulnerability, and then they have their specific requirements or needs. Like shelter is a need of everyone, but if we talk about health requirement, or we talk about the nutrition, or we talk about wash services, then the older men and women and those with disabilities have some specific requirement, and which needs some additional resources to allocate while you are responding to that emergency or disaster. But if the data is not available, then not a single agency is in a position to respond to the specific needs of the older people. So it's always an issue during the response that we are not finding the accurate data, not accurate, but some data which can give you an idea that how much older women and men are in a need of some specific like interventions. So what we are advocating with all the humanitarian actors in the Pakistan, especially like with the government department, there is a National Disaster Management Authority and Provincial Disaster Management Authority. So these authorities are involved in this data collection and the rapid need assessment, and we are doing advocacy continuously with them, along with the UN agencies or other stakeholders who are involved in this, that this sex, age, and disability disaggregated data is the basic thing which they have to do in their response, so they can respond to the specific needs of specific groups. So it's a continuous advocacy with them. So far, in some cases, we get some of the data, but not when we talk about the rapid need assessment reports, then it's not reflecting in those reports. So that's one of the issue which we are facing just from our experience in the Pakistan. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Moise. Yeah, I think the issue of data, good data is a really important one, and really often overlooked. Either it isn't collected at all. Sometimes we see data collected that's only on older people over 60, so that doesn't necessarily kind of capture the variety of needs for older people and different age groups. Yeah, it's something that can make a life-saving difference, you know, once we have a better understanding and sort of who is where and what they need. So Carole, I think I'd like to come back to you with another question. So, I mean, this is a little bit at the myths, but I think also just from your experience, you know, why do you think there isn't sufficient attention to older people in disasters? So what do policymakers and maybe funders who, you know, don't quite understand, but that you've seen yourself?
I think maybe before I answer that question, just to write on something that Syed said about data. One of the things that is really missing is the issue of data. And you've also mentioned, Jane, that a lot of data just completely blocks out a certain age group. And why that happens now brings me to my to the answer to your question. I think there is no attention, and I'll speak from the African perspective. For a long time, Africa has described itself as a young continent. If you look at policy papers, if you look at sessional papers, if you look at anything that is written about Africa from a planning perspective, whether it's economic or political, whatever, Africa is described as a young continent. And I think that's where the problem comes in. It is true that the demographics of Africa are such that Africa has a larger, the larger population of Africa is younger rather than older, but they're not going to be young forever. And this blindness to age becomes a problem, and it kind of colors the way society, the way governments look at younger people, at older people, sorry. For that reason, you find that plans, programs, budgets do not then take care of a certain age group. And I'll give a quick example on the issue of, say, sexual and reproductive health. When you have government policies that look at women from the age of 49 downwards, what happens to the 50-year-old woman, even if we were to neglect everybody else above 51 to 80, what happens to the 50-year-old? Because everything stops almost at 49. So the plans and programs of governments then do not cater to the needs of older people when there is no crisis. So when a crisis happens, then you can see that there's absolute total confusion. And we've seen that when COVID happened. We've seen that with the floods that happened in the DRC, recently in Nigeria, Cyclone Idai in Mozambique not too long ago, the drought that is currently ravaging the Horn of Africa. We see that governments are ill prepared to deal with the issues of older people because they've neglected it pre-humanitarian crisis. So there's no way that when the crisis happens, they'll be ready to deal with it. I think for me, that's where the problem lies.
Yeah, amazing. That's really important. Thank you, Carole. Moise, I wanted to come back to you. Just, thinking about an overall response to any humanitarian emergency. You have both you have organizations like HelpAge and our partners, who do more of a targeted response, focused on older people first, but also their families and communities. And then at the same time, you have a lot of, often larger organizations, humanitarian organizations, providing, much needed life-saving aid, across the board. So would just be curious from your experience in Pakistan, sort of how the interplay between those different types of organizations, is one more important than the other, or how are they both important? In ensuring an adequate and equal response. Thanks.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, it's an important thing because a lot of humanitarian organizations, the national and international, are responding to these crises, and they are like providing the services to the whole community, not a targeted one, but all the affected population. And when we are talking about older people specific issues, sometimes they say that we are covering it under the other vulnerable groups. So other vulnerable groups, but when we ask about how they are responding to the specific needs of those, then they don't have any specific intervention. What we are doing from HelpAge International side, like we are also catering the need of the community or the household, but to the older people. So we are giving them a priority and also addressing their specific needs. Just for example, if we are providing health services or in collaboration with other organization who is specialized in the health services, but we include a few components. For example, we providing the assistive technology like assistive devices to the older people or person with disability. They need some specific items so that they are enabled to do their activities of daily living. Similarly, the wash, if we are providing services, we are taking care that we provide, for example, the jerry can, which the older person can easily carry. So it's not a bigger one, which they can, it's like the load is, they cannot carry that much load, so we can provide it a smaller one. Similarly, in other interventions, there are small interventions, but it make their life easy. The older people, the older men and women. Similarly, like most of the older people, they have problems like their eyesight is weak. So in the evening when they go out, especially in the disaster when there is no electricity, and in the evening they go out for any toilet or any of their needs, so they have a problem of the visibility. So what we are trying that we ensure that we provide some kind of light like the solar lamp or other, so that they can easily go and do their activities. And we also link it with the protection issues, because you are providing these kind of items. It's not only the older people, but within their family, like the women or the girls, they can also benefit from that. But we are taking care of the specific needs of the specific group, then of course it also like benefit the other their household, but the family members. But in certain cases, it's only the older people who need those kind of support. But it like we during one of I remember after the flood in 2010, we organized the communities, especially the older men and women, and we provided a kind of training on the community-based disaster risk management. And we trained them. And recently, when I'm currently in the flood-affected districts, and I met with the community just to learn what was their response and how the older people responded to the flood. So they mentioned that the training which we did like 4 or 5 years back, that helped them during the evacuation, because during the training we engaged the older people and they shared their traditional way that how they are coping with the previous floods. They like shared some of their examples, and then we trained the community with the involvement of the older people that how they can use the local resources for the evacuation. Like for example, the tire tube. They are making a kind of boat from the tube, and then they are using it during the flood for evacuation. So we are not seeing like the older person only, like they have a lot of problems, but they are also a solution on the other side. So what we are trying that we are focusing to provide some relief directly to those specific groups within our response, whether it's in the wash, whether it's the health, it's the protection, or it's the food even. Like because in the food all the humanitarian organization, they are providing a ration or the food pack, but the older people have their own nutrition requirement. So if we provide, like for example, the multi-purpose cache, so they enable it to them, they can buy food of their choice, which is like easily available, which they can easily digest, which is nutrition to them. So these are just a few examples which in our context, what through HelpAge we are doing here in Pakistan. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's great to hear about some of those interventions, you know, and how you've identified sometimes just a small intervention, like the size of a jerry can make a huge difference. But it is about really understanding and knowing what people's needs are, you know, and the typical ration or food pack may not be quite suitable for them. And so to enable people to have the choices that for things that work for them. You know, and I think one of the points you raised, it kind of leads well perfectly into what I wanted to come back to you, Francisco, on, which is, you know, the role that older people play in responding to humanitarian crises. You know, not only for themselves, but their families and their communities. You know, so we heard, you know, some examples from you know, from Pakistan and how people have their sort of traditional ways and knowledge that can really assist them. But Francisco, I just wanted to hear from you, some of the examples of, how you've seen older people, the roles they play in their communities, how you've collaborated with them. Thanks. And just unmute yourself.
Saying I'm going to build in a practical manner from what Carole just said and Moes, but first image coming to my mind, and this one, I want to thank my colleague Martin Correa from CWS, because in the end he was the one who took us to that path, is Atiles Salim. Atiles has 108 years old. She is not just a beneficiary of our programs in Jeremy, South Haiti. She is a volunteer, a trained volunteer that actually was crucial when we started the emergency support to help with the earthquake consequences, because, she was the best one knowing the communities. So she became vital for planning, content of WASH Kids, type of food support, how to address cash transfers with older people, the role of older people in breeding goats. That was all about her, and then, of course, she became trained because she wanted in core humanitarian standards, in safeguarding. And then at this point, I would say project would not have been implemented without her. That's my first image. The second, I'm gonna see 2-3 examples. The second example is Camilo. Camilo is close. He's gonna be 60 years old soon. He's the indigenous authority of the Mapachira community, a Wayuu community in the Manawi Desert in North Colombia coast, currently flooded as a consequence of climate change. One hurricane and 2 straight tropical storms have devastated that area. Camilo is the authority of a community in which 3 children just passed some weeks ago because of contaminated water consumption. Of course, flooding contaminated available, very scarce sources of rainwater collected. Therefore, we at some point we arrived there with the sort of the request from the Colombian government to collaborate. We did not arrive alone. We arrived actually with 3 local partners, some of whom are present here, like Gold. And then and then we found Camilo. Camilo does not speak Spanish. He only speaks Wayuu language, which is oral, not written, just oral. Therefore, in Wayuu culture, word, what you say, that's everything. There's no way to change it. You can write. So once we saw and got to know the whole situation and sit down with Camilo then in Wayuu, by the end of the meeting, he told us, I think you have spoken with the truth. And because of that, I want to tell you that in the end, we do not expect anything from you. But if you can, I will ask for only one favor. Take the word of the Wayuu people to the people of your community. That's how he understands HelpAge, to the other side of the sea and ask them for water. So, Camilo's leadership in the end has caused that now we found the ways to repair wells, do community organization, and in weeks they will have a water purifying plant that would have never happened without Camilo. Because Camilo spoke to us and supported us and asked us to take the Wayuu word to the other side of the sea, the rest of the community got involved and participated. And that's how it happened. Final example.
Francisco, I'm so sorry. I know we're all on the edge of our seat to hear from you, but I'm just conscious of the time.
Okay.
And I know we do have some questions from our, from the audience, so we can, we can hear from you in that context. But I wanted to just, thank you so much. Oh, this is amazing. I really want to go and meet those wonderful colleagues. But Amber, I had a question for you. From your perspective and at the AARP Foundation, just why AARP Foundation has chosen to support older people in humanitarian emergencies.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. And I'll try and be quick so we can get into that meaty question and answer period. I've been with AARP Foundation since 2015, and in that time since then, the foundation has awarded more than $15 million in grants for international and domestic humanitarian or disaster relief response. And AARP Foundation is motivated to support older adults in disasters because of the reasons my fellow presenters have really already highlighted. Because older adults are disproportionately impacted by disasters, and because older adults have unique needs and abilities during a disaster and in post-disaster recovery. So we're really keen on recognizing that general response or recovery efforts may be inadequate because they don't specifically address the older adult population. And so our funding has been awarded to great organizations like HelpAge, who are specifically have a demonstrated history of working with and understanding the needs and abilities of older adults.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Amber. Thanks for your support. And I'd like to turn it over now to Latrice, who's going to guide us through the question and answer. And thank you so much to all of our panelists.
Great. Thank you, Jane. Yes, we do have a few questions that have come in. And one of them, I think Carole would be interested in answering this one, I think she said. How is climate change impacting the issue of caring for older adults in the humanitarian crisis?
Thanks, Latrice. I think the issue of climate change, one, how it's impacting is that it's a cause of a lot of the crises that older people face, and therefore the issue of caring for them comes into play, as has already been mentioned by myself and my fellow panelists in the discussion that we've had. But the other way that it's impacting how older people are cared for is that where there's neglect of older people, it only makes it worse. So it makes bad situations worse. We've seen health systems that struggle to cater to the needs of older people completely crumble in the face of COVID. We've seen the conflicts, resource-related conflicts that then give rise to humanitarian crises, and these are quite a few and have been in Africa, only make bad situations worse. If you look at the amount of violence that is meted on older women who've been left behind when their families have run to safety in the DRC, it's actually it's mind-blowing to just think about the level of sexual abuse, the level of violence that has been meted out on women who've been faced up with a conflict in the DRC. And then the final example I'll provide is with Ghana, and this has been played out in Kenya, Malawi, Tanzania as well, where the climate change has created a situation where families no longer can provide the subsistence that agriculture provides for them. And so the older women and older men who take care of the farms as their children work in the urban areas then become victims of accusations that they are the cause of the problems. we've got situations where a woman who is bent over because she's old is accused of being a witch and accused of being the cause of the failing rains or whatever else they choose to accuse them of. And in places like Ghana, they're then scattered away to a remote area of the country, away from their families, away from what they know, and subjected to a lot of loneliness as a result. So climate change is both a cause and a consequence of the violations of older people's rights in a lot of situations in Africa.
Thank you, Carole. And any of our panelists, if you all would like to turn your cameras back on, you can answer any of these questions. How is providing for older adults in humanitarian crises different for adults who live in some form of senior housing, such as assisted living and skilled nursing facilities?
I can jump in, and I'm thinking maybe more a little bit in terms of domestically than necessarily internationally. But I think it's really key to not sort of put all older adults into one general category, right? So the needs of older adults that might be in assisted living situations have specific needs sort of before a disaster strikes, during the disaster, and post-disaster that we need to be aware of and understand and address. That is sort of going to, again, be different than sort of carte blanche how we serve all older adults. So this is within the older adult population, there are specific populations that we need to be really mindful of and be thinking of throughout a disaster situation.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I would say they are like very different sort of features, characteristics there. Inside the humanitarian disaster, you will find that older people are in different sort of situations. You will find that some families will remain together, like the complete family, but also a lot of families will split. Working age adults will rapidly try to generate income in any way possible to cope with the needs, and probably grandparents will have to take care of children. That would be another sort of situation. So instead of being cared, other people will care for the children. And thirdly, it is sad, but also happens that in the context of humanitarian emergencies, older people can get abandoned, alone. So they just will have their own situation as what they are. They will not count on anything to get support. Those three different situations can happen in a disaster, as what we have learned from data. Again, in full families, in complete families, they might get supported. They might be cared by some member or members of the family. In split families, they might have a very different role. They would have to care for children, but they also could turn being alone and isolated. Those would be like basic situations I can see.
Thank you, Francisco. We have another question. I think we still have some time left. What is your message for USAID and other major funders of humanitarian assistance, and what policy changes would facilitate the meaningful inclusion of older persons in humanitarian response?
I don't know, maybe Moaz, you want to jump in? not,
I could jump in if that's okay, and say that USAID and other major funders must continue to support humanitarian assistance with an age lens, if I may use that word, because and they must also demand for age inclusive, or ask for, not demand for, but call for age inclusive data, age inclusive evidence, because it exists. The RNA that was included in the presentation is just one of the many RNAs, rapid needs assessments that are done, but there are also other studies and case studies that have been done that show the vulnerability of older people, but also show the voice and agency that older people can bring in the humanitarian response and in the planning for mitigating some of the effects before the humanitarian crisis happens. The policy changes, I think, would be to ensure that where we have laws and policies that take into account the needs of older people, they must be included in the discussions, in the plans, in the planning, in the budgeting for humanitarian response. And older people must be brought to the table because they have something to offer. I think those are some of the practical things that can be done.
Thank you, Carole. Well, we're wrapping up on our time right now. I'd like to thank everyone for this important conversation that we're having. But if we can give about 10 seconds, just wanted to get our any final thoughts from our panelists, any final reflections from you all. Maybe Jane, if you'd like to give any final reflections, and then we will probably end there.
Well, first of all, a huge thank you to everyone, to Grantmakers in Aging, the John A. Hartford Foundation for supporting this, and for everyone for your really sharing your rich experience and your perspectives coming from many different time zones and locations. Yeah, and to everyone who participated today, I think it's really important to feel this community of people who care about these issues, who are interested in the rights and dignity of older people. And I can speak for HelpAge and for all of us. We'd be thrilled to be in contact with any of you as follow up to this webinar. So please do reach out, and thank you again.
Great. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for sharing your expertise with us today. And I'd especially like to thank HelpAge USA President and CEO Cindy Cox-Roman for her efforts in organizing this webinar. Thank you to the John A. Hartford Foundation. And I'd like to say thank you to HelpAge USA, American Society on Aging, and the National Council on Aging for your partnership. As a reminder, we will be making today's presentation available to anyone who wishes to view it later, including the slides and the audio. So watch for an email to be sent within a few days. Please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and our LinkedIn page, and complete a brief survey to help us improve our programming. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. Please be well. Thank you.
Thank you.